Biggest lessons for other entrepreneurs. What's lesson number one?
Well, I think it's the number one, Benji, is if you're going to partner with someone, make sure that they have a car. That's a really good one.
Huge takeaway from this episode,
yes.
I think.
No, the first one, and this is hard to do because I have learned from every failure, and there are so many. But I think the first one, like, if it would be patience and discipline. That's kind of the bullet there. Should we dive into that?
Yes, please.
Okay. So there was something I saw, I don't even know, it was probably a couple years ago. It was a guy that was in a business group that I was in, and he just posted it, but it stuck with me. And he said, the fastest path is a straight line through the long cut. And I was like, I love that. You know, like, what's the long cut? Like, what's the fastest way to build something is doing it right, not taking any shortcut. And it's really hard to resist that temptation. You really do have to keep questioning, like, is this done right yet? Is this done right yet? And continue to question. And it's so hard. It takes a lot of discipline to do that. Because doing things right really does take time.
Well, that's
familiar?
That's why it's hard. Like, the day-to-day experience, the lived experience of it is that it actually, you perceive it as very, very slow. You're like a glacier moving, and it's like, come on. Like, I see this, this stock going to the moon. I see this entrepreneur doing something super cool, and I'm just like, dinking out over like the reporting in my CRM. Like, couldn't this go any faster? And I think that is the day-to-day experience. But if you look at it from a much broader perspective, you look at it retroactively, it actually happens pretty quickly. It just feels slow when you're in it. So that I love that lesson. Anything to add to that, Igor?
Yeah, definitely. I think, people really, really underestimate how long your timeline and time horizon really is, right? To Eric's point, like, it absolutely takes a whole bunch of time to build great foundational teams, systems, processes, structures in a business. And there's just so many of them, right? From like legal foundations, accounting and financial foundations, taking your time to vet and pick really like the right team members. So this hiring decision that we made 2 days ago, we've been interviewing for like 4.5 months in a key role, right? Like, there's just things really take time, not to mention the building, as you said, of like standard operating procedures and onboarding programs and training programs of staff, all this stuff. But at the end of the day, you can build a ton of really good stuff in, Eric, what do we call it? Let's say 4 to 5 years of really focused work. Is that reasonable? You build a lot of cool stuff.
You'd be amazed at what you can do in 4 to 5 years.
Totally. And the question I would really pose to everyone to think about is 4 to 5 years of system and structure building a long time in the grand scheme of your career? That seems like really good value, right? Yeah. And one of the things I find cool is to map out at, in this case, we're all very young, but to map out on a timeline, almost like to scale, draw it out on one of these really long pieces of paper, where you started, where you're at now, and what your time horizon looks like, even to a relatively early retirement. And you've got a long way to go, right? So I think people don't realize that there really isn't anywhere that you have to rush to. While, yes, Bitcoin and Dogecoin and this stock and that stock is going up in that tech company. If you can pull out that noise, you actually have quite a long runway. And if you build really good foundational structure for a couple of years and then scale for the next 10, let's just say in 15 years, you can build something absolutely epic. And 15 years to work on something, look at, just zoom out generations past, your grandfather, your great grandfather. If you said, I'm working really hard for 15 years and then I'm golden, people would be like, that's crazy. But it's totally doable.
Yeah.
To frame this a different way, when you say, okay, 4 to 5 years to build foundational stuff, it doesn't really seem that long in the grander scheme, and no, it doesn't. But I've seen the opposite, where you can not follow this rule. You can be in a rush. You can get distracted by shiny objects, and 4 or 5 years goes by. You're exhausted and you have nothing.
Well, we see that with contractors.
And you have nothing. You're baseless. You're kind of rebuilding from square one, and it's because this lesson that Eric has shared it hasn't sunk in on you yet. But I think usually at that point, people,
totally,
they get it and they make a change in their habits, a change in their mindset, and they do this. They follow this.
Yeah, exactly. And if you were to
totally
say
agree with you, but oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, to build 4 or 5 years to build strong infrastructure foundations, the baseline, and then to spend 10 years to scale. So you're 15 years in to create a great business. You could do that like 3 times in your career if you wanted to, right?
Well, and you know, I think when you say that, Igor, people hear like there's something like people might feel like I'm sacrificing if I just take my time for. It's like, no. That's the thing. That's the illusion. It is a faster growth path. Totally. You're not going to sacrifice growth building better systems. Your business we've been growing without trying to grow. We literally like, hey, we're not going to grow this year. We're just going to work on our system. And it just grows because we're making things better. So I think it's important that people realize that, like, no, you don't sacrifice anything. You're sacrificing growth when you're focused on like growth rather than just doing it right. Too, like, you know, to your point, Benji, you don't end up having to go back and do things a second time. Doing things twice takes longer than doing them once right.
Yeah, and I mean, this, you know, that this is a universal truth when it applies to the macro scale. We're talking about big business scaling. It also applies to the micro. Like, I'm sure on your painting sites, you train your new painters, hey, I would rather you scrape and sand this properly, use the proper primer, do it right once, because if you don't, we're going to do an inspection at the end, and you're going to be painting the same wall or the same window twice, sometimes 3 times. So there's something very universal about this lesson that I love.
Yeah, I instill in this concept in our team all the time is to be thorough and do things really well, A to Z, before we move on, and that applies to so many things in business. And Eric, that I think is the key concept to like going slower in order to go fast. Now, I just want to clarify, if some people are if they're not clear on what exactly that entails, like what kind of stuff are you talking about? Give me a bit of the lay of the land over the last year and the upcoming few years. What are some of these, what is some of this groundwork that you're working on?
Gosh, it's one example is just our CRM and our QuickBooks aligning, cross-checking, and reconciling so that we know where every penny is and every penny's been collected and our numbers are clear everywhere.
Totally.
That has taken like 2 years.
Scale to 50 million if you don't even know where the dollars are at.
That is exactly right. Yeah, if we're leaking $5,000 now, like that adds up to a lot of money as we grow.
Totally.
But that would be one example. Another, I think the guide for us, I think it's important that we have a guide. You got to have some standard for knowing when it's done. And so one thing is, you know, we want to attract really amazing people into our business. Well, to do that, we need to be able to compensate people really well to attract really great people. Yep. But to compensate them really well, they have to perform really well in their role. So there's certain performance measures we want to see in our company before we scale. And if those performance measures aren't happening, we know we've got more work to do. You know, we need our customer experience to be really exceptional. And it's really hard to do that, you know, at scale. So it's hard to answer because we don't know until we see the performance metrics and everything where we want them to be. And that's going to be a little different for everybody. Because if I'm going to go and try and build $110 million companies, I have higher standards for what's necessary for that foundation than if you're going to build, you know, one $10 million company.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, and I know just a couple other really important ones here. Like, I know you're doing a lot of work on your like operational, training processes, learning like the LMS in the organization, right? That's a piece. Yeah,
big time.
You got a bunch of legal stuff going on.
Like that took me a year and a half to get those. I mean, that is an incredible legal agreement, and it took forever. And things that is not my thing. You know, it took a lot of like thinking and dwelling on it and understanding every page of 70 pages of agreement. And
totally. I've seen that time and time again, people not put enough focus on that. So like I would have spent years building out our legal infrastructure, hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. But are you going to build a great business on a weak legal infrastructure that can topple? No. Absolutely not, because that's how you really get screwed. Totally. Right. There's those recruitment and selection and people, I think, is also a huge one. You know, you talked about like how quick it was to partner, right? I mean, that's having the recruiting infrastructure in place and the ability to select really great people, I think, is a huge part of scaling. I think the way that I look at it, and Benji, I think we see the opposite of this all the time, where people just want to scale. I would argue, unless you have a bunch of all this stuff in place, including the ability to build really good teams, you've not earned the right to scale effectively.
No, you haven't.
And it's going to burn you. It's going to bite you too.
Yeah.
Well, those are the major setbacks that people who haven't learned this lesson and have been humbled by it yet experience, and that's why you can, be 6 years in and still feel somewhat empty-handed. That's lesson 1, patience and discipline. What is lesson number 2?